Welcome to this lecture on virtue ethics, part two, where we finish up what we began to discuss in the previous lecture on virtue ethics. So, having gone through and really spelled out what the components of virtue ethics as a normative theory is, which namely is that once we identify that the ultimate good of human beings is to flourish as human beings, and that for them to do that is to exercise their function as human beings, that is, as people who make good decisions, who rationally, actively figure stuff out regarding the practical elements of life. Um, uh, that virtues are the excellences that are required for them to do that, and that they've got to figure out how to express those virtues in specific situations. We get a large picture then of what morality, or at least how morality is to be achieved. It's to be achieved through cultivating, developing, and exercising these excellences, these virtues of what it is to be a flourishing human being in order to achieve such flourishing. So, as a normative theory, what we want to do today now in this lecture is get a sense of what sort of the benefits or positives of this theory is, as well as what maybe some of the criticism or negatives of this theory are as well. So let's look at a few positives, and then we'll get into some important criticisms of this theory. One positive that's worth noting and talking about is that virtue ethics as a theory um, is somewhat helpful in its description of what virtues are. That is, that they are thick moral concepts. And by thick, obviously don't mean literally thick. Um, uh, like a triple cheeseburger at Wendy's is thick, right? I don't mean thick in that way, but it's the same kind of idea in the sense of having a lot of substance. But here, of course, we're talking about conceptual substance. So virtues are thick in this sense because they are both prescriptive and descriptive, in the sense that they prescribe the kinds of attitudes and behaviors that people should have. Okay, so they're prescriptive in that sense, but they also describe uh, good and excellent attitudes and behaviors. So they do both things here. They're the sorts of things that we can use as character traits or attributes of people, and at the same time also prescribe them as the kinds of things that ought to be done. So they have a lot of conceptual substance, and another way of putting that is that they do a lot of conceptual work. So that's one benefit of the theory itself, is that it's very helpful in that it does all of these things. Another thing that's often pointed out about why virtue ethics makes sense, and um, why we should think that it has a lot of cogency, is because it makes intuitive sense about the proper moral motivations that we should have, and even just about what proper moral motivation is. That correct action results from virtuous motivation. I'll give you an example of where this of why this makes sense. Um, Here on the campus in which I work, we have a nursing building that's on the other side of campus, and out next to that nursing building is this really nice pond. Now, let's suppose that I am driving by that pond by the nursing building, and I happen to notice that there is I don't know, a toddler, a 2 or 3 year old that is drowning in this pond. Um, so forgive me for the horrific example here, but sometimes using extreme examples help make the point that we try to make. Um, so I noticed that that child is drowning, and it's a horrible thing. And what's the virtuous thing to do here? Well, the virtuous thing to do, arguably, would be to go and save this child, to go dive in and save the child. But suppose that before I do this, I call the newspapers, I call a couple of TV news stations, and I tell them that, hey, there is fixing to be a baby saving out here at the nursing building pond. So show up with your cameras, show up with your best reporters. It's going to be the biggest story of the week, right? And so I call them, and then I wait for them to get there before I go and save the child. Now, let's just assume, for the purposes of this example, that no additional harm was done to this child by waiting. I know in real life that seems hard to believe, but let's just, for the purpose of this example, assume that it really made no difference. So I waited there for them to come, then I went in and saved the child. Now, what if Well, so we'll call that case one. Case two is I go save the child instantly without bothering to call anybody. I just go and dive in and save the child out of this pond. Now, most people are going to say that what I did in case two was the morally right thing, and that in case one, even though technically did the right thing, I wouldn't save the child. There was something just horribly creepy and corrupt about the motivation that I had for doing it, which actually um, uh, lends good reason for thinking that maybe I didn't do the morally right thing there. Some people are just not sure that there's actually any ethically right stuff going on there. Well, virtue ethics helps us make sense of those two cases. It helps us make sense of that first case, what the moral corruption is. That is, correct action itself on virtue theory is never independent of virtue that is part of one's disposition internally. So that's what I mean here by correct action results from virtuous motivation. For virtue ethics, there's got to be both going on here. The other side of that coin then too is that no one gets lucky at doing the right thing. There's no such thing as moral luck on virtue ethics. It can't just be the case that I walk by the pond, for instance, and I uh, put my hand down to get some water, and I feel and there's a baby there, or a toddler there, and I just get snagged on my pinky finger, and I pull this toddler up out of the water, and the toddler is saved, and everybody says, "Oh my gosh, you did this wonderfully moral thing." Well, that's not going to be the case either, because I just kind of got lucky in that case. There was no motivation to do anything right. Um, just happened to coincidentally pull this toddler up out of the water. So whether the motivation is non-existent at all, or the motivation um, is a corrupt one about my own narcissism and being selfish, even though the same action results, and the action itself we might say is a good one, nonetheless, for on virtue ethics in both of those cases, it's going to be the case that both of those situations are non-moral or immoral, right? That the ethical rightness is not achieved in those cases because the action didn't match the motivation. And three, virtue ethics gives us a very comprehensive framework for assessing moral behavior. And one way to think about this is what more modern virtue ethicists will call multi-track dispositions. We saw that with the chart that we looked at in the last lecture, right? If you remember, there is 3 columns to that chart. The middle column is virtue, and each opposite column, whether of deficiency or excess, is a defect or a vice of some sort. And what modern virtue ethicists want us to help understand is that whenever you are being courageous, for instance, or truthful or generous, whatever virtue we have in mind, the one I'm using here as an example is courage. Whenever you are being courageous, whenever you possess the virtue of courage, it's more than just that. It's more than just having courage, because at the same time you are actively um, how do I put this? You are actively hating, you are actively avoiding each vice, each defect of excess as well as deficiency. So there's at least 3 tracks going on here: having courage and deflecting from the temptation to harbor and exercise each defect, whether rashness, which in the case of courage is the vice of excess, or cowardice, which in this case is the vice of deficiency, right? So there's a lot going on there, and it's always a balancing act in each specific situation to know what it is and how best to exercise courage in any particular situation. But at the same time, I would be remiss if I did not point out that there are indeed some problems with virtue theory. There have been some really important criticisms for virtue theory. One criticism that has often been put forward against virtue theory is that it offers no principles that guide decisions about correct actions. Let me give you an example here of what I mean by this. There is another moral theory, a normative theory called utilitarianism, and it has a really nice, easy formula to follow. What it says is that the right thing to do, the morally right thing to do, is always going to be that which provides the most amount of good for the most amount of people. Now, of course, a lot of those terms in that statement I just made need to be defined and that sort of thing, which I'm not going to do right now. But that's a nice formula. Figure out what's going to provide the best consequences at the end of the day, and then do that action that's going to bring about those consequences. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy, right? Easy to do. Virtue theory is a little bit more than that. Um, you know, it's how do you point to virtues in order to solve a problem like the trolley problem, or like whether a society should have euthanasia and assisted suicide. It doesn't seem so easy. There's no real sort of formulaic way in which to calculate morality or how to achieve morality here. Rosalind Hursthouse, who is probably one of the more important neo-Aristotelian virtue ethicists in the 20th and 21st century, has written and responded to this in so much of her work. And as she puts it, when you're practicing virtue, that is, when you develop virtue and you exercise and practice virtue, in a sense, what you're doing is out of that giving yourselves rules to follow. In other words, you are taking so much of the data from that which you base virtue on, the exemplars that you point to. You are taking much of what you're just learning through common sense and the exercise of practical wisdom and how to exercise virtue, how to exercise human excellences in different situations. And in a sense, you distill all of that and you give yourselves rules to follow on the basis of that. Um, at a very basic and general level, the rules you're giving yourself are things like, do this and don't do that, right? Do X, don't do Y. So doing the right thing is going to be partly exercising virtue, right? Partly avoiding vice. So this goes back to the multi-track disposition thing that I noted on the previous slide, right? Giving yourselves rules to follow and how best to achieve this, how best to make sure that these sorts of things come out in your concrete behavior. So yeah, there's no formula here, but really at the end of the day, it's just called living life. It's called developing moral maturity, and the more morally mature you become, the more efficient and proficient and accurate your own judgments are about exercising virtue and avoiding defects. Another criticism that often gets pointed out about virtue theory is this one, that you might ever be in a situation where virtues conflict or where there's a conflict between which sort of virtues you should exercise at a particular time. So how would you decide one of those over the other? Uh, Here's an example for you. I could consider, or I could come up with, or at least imagine a case where I have a friend who is, dealing with substance abuse and has for a long time. And it's been the case that I've been able to help this friend, help him out of troubles, help him out of financial problems. But at the same time, in doing that, it has taken a toll on my own family and my own responsibility to support my family, to steward my resources um, as best I can, and to do so efficiently for the sake of my family. So that gets kind of tough after a while, uh, and such that it might be the case as well that what my friend really needs is some hardcore justice. They need maybe to be turned into the authorities, or they need to be completely cut off from any charity, you might argue, or they need just as we put in our vernacular, a good come to Jesus meeting where we just kind of get straight with them, right? So that's a sort of dilemma that I think a lot of people face, right, in one way or another. Right? How do I keep being generous, exercise charity in these cases, and yet exercise the virtue of justice as well, right? You do the crime, you do the time, even if that means cutting off the friendship. So what someone who is criticizing virtue theory is going to say is that in that case, you can't do both, right? You can't be generous and you can't be just in that case. So which virtue are you going to pick to exercise here? Now, there's a couple of responses to this. The first one is not the best response. In a way, it's a little bit of a fallacy to sort of make this move and just to kind of point fingers uh, back at other theories. So I'm not using this response in that way, but just to help set some context here, that every moral framework faces this problem. Every normative theory faces this problem. Any normative theory that's going to explain how best to exercise morality is going to have to solve the problem of what to do when moral principles or virtues or decisions uh, conflict with one another. So that's nothing new here. It's nothing unique to virtue theory. But I think a specific way to answer this particular problem or objection to virtue theory is to remember, and this goes back to our chart, this goes back to the example we gave about exercising generosity at the birthday party versus at the wedding, right? Uh, in both cases, we're acting generously, even though it looks different in those cases. We have to remember that exercising virtue is always going to be a degree bearing thing, given the specifics of the situation, and avoiding clashes between virtues. And the reason why we're avoiding clashes between virtues here is because, first of all, we know that on virtue theory, right, you should always be just, you should always be generous or charitable, you should always be truthful, always be courageous, and on that goes. And theoretically, anyway, for virtue theory, how that works is it's argued that you can indeed exercise all of those virtues at the same time, all the time. But what that means and what that's going to require is that generosity indeed is going to be different at different times of your day in different situations. Just like acting justly towards someone is going to look different at different times of the day in the different situations that you're in. And that's why we need the practical wisdom bit. That's why true moral exemplars have practical wisdom to a great degree, is because they have learned, they have figured out how to balance out the exercising of all these virtues such that they are all exercised all the time in every situation throughout the day, right? So what seems like a conflict here really isn't going to be one. You might argue then, or a virtue ethicist might argue that in the thought experiment or this example that I gave, that indeed, in that case, it might be the point where the most charitable or generous thing I can do with my friend now is not give them a dime, but give them some tough love. And through tough love, I'm being generous to them by helping shake them up, especially if that's going to be effective for them, as well as a very just thing to do by cutting off uh, the subsidy that I've been doing for this friend at that time. So I think we need to do a little bit of creative thinking in how we already sort of practice these things as it is and come to understand what it is to be generous and what it is to be just and truthful in various situations. These are degree bearing kinds of things. Another problem with virtue theory that isn't the easiest one to solve. I think this is a very specific problem that has a lot of interesting credence to it, if we want to put it that way, is what's called the situationist critique. This is a very academic, very philosophical criticism. There's been books written on this stuff as well as responding to this critique. And so in the academic world of virtue ethics, which is not the real world, I will admit to you. Uh, Although some of my friends who work in this might be somewhat offended if they heard me say that, but I'm just being honest, right? This is not the real world. This is the world where people get to spend most of their day thinking about philosophical problems and reflecting on them and writing about them, which is great. It's a wonderful thing. But I'm saying that just to help calm your nerves a little bit, right? This isn't something you have to rack your brain over. I'll try to explain it the best that I can. What the situationist critique says is that at the end of the day, when we actually look at human behavior, when we do studies on human behavior and try some different experiments and see what it is that people do, that that how they respond, how they act, is not out of virtue. Anytime you test it, you really can't say that people are acting out of virtue. What they're acting out of what their behavior is affected by are different aspects of various situations that are morally irrelevant, that have nothing to do with morality. So as I have it put here, the situationist critique says that human behavior is affected by morally irrelevant situational factors, not virtues. So let's get into this as to what they mean by this. Two of the leading philosophers that have developed this critique are John Doris and Gilbert Harman. That's them here, their photographs. And what they have done is they've conducted lots of studies and appealed to other people's studies and have shown that all kinds of things that'll raise or improve people's mood as well as depress people's moods or attitudes, right? Or just the mood that they're in. Things like various lights and sounds, things like being in the presence of people, that all these kinds of things really are what affect our actions, not virtue and not vice, right? Or defect. One of the examples that they give, that they point to in order to make this point, is what they call the phone booth experiment that was conducted in 1972 by Eisen and Levin. And the phone booth experiment, it pretty much goes like this. Um, they're on a busy street corner in a major city. And how would I explain this? I asked that question because as I'm thinking about it here, I'm not sure that so many of you know what a phone booth is or what a payphone is, because we've not had any around for many, many years. Well, let me give you an example. When I was a teenager, the local mall near where I grew up used to have these just massive carrels of payphones, right? It might have 20 or 30 phones in a carrel. And that was kind of the place where you hang out, because you would, hang out by that phone and uh, call down to the other carrel of phones at the other end of the mall and see if any of your friends were down there, and you could sort of get together and hang out. Um, but there was always sort of an unstated rule when you went to a payphone. You would always you would always check the coin return slot to see if a quarter was in there. And if there was a quarter in there, then I mean your day was made, because now you get a free call. I mean that 25 cents gets you 15 minutes on a local call. And so it's like, wow, a free phone call. I know we don't think about that too much in the age of cell phones now, but that was a big deal. Um, and so that's what you did, and oftentimes that would happen because payphones were mechanical and things would wear out, and sometimes they wouldn't always hold the money that people put in them to make phone calls. So every now and then you could end up with a quarter free phone call. So knowing that, in 1972, Eisen and Levin designed this experiment where someone off the street, just the people that they were testing, would enter this phone booth. And at the time that they entered the phone booth, there would be an actor watching them, and the actor would walk by holding just a massive pile of folders, crazy folders and loose leaf paper, such that if they were to drop it, it just made a big mess and went everywhere. And that was the point. They would walk by these people in the phone booth who are getting ready to make a call at about the same time that they checked the coin slot. And the test was to see whether or not the person in the phone booth would come out of the booth, come out of making the call that they were going to make, to help them pick up all those folders and papers. And what they found was that the vast majority of time that someone found a quarter in the coin slot and thus was going to get a free phone call, the vast majority of those times, those people would actually come out and help the actor. They don't know it's an actor, right? They're being tested here. Help that actor pick up all of his or her folders and loose leaf paper. And a vast majority of time that people did not find a quarter in the coin slot, in the coin return slot, majority of those times they would not come out and help the person pick up all their folders and loose leaf paper. And I guess I should say, from how I understand the experiment, how they did it, it's not as if the actor asked them to do so. So in neither cases were they asked to do so. It was just a test to see if they would, exercise virtue of the generosity of their time and whatever else, right? And come out and help. So if They found a quarter, they would help. If they didn't, they wouldn't. That's fascinating because what people like Doris and Harmon want to say is that right there just really shows that virtue is a meaningless concept. People don't have virtues. If they did, then finding a quarter in the coin slot shouldn't matter whatsoever. That's a problem. Another example of this is the famous Milgram experiment from 1974, where people were tested in order to see if they would inflict pain and punishment on people at the word of an authority, even when it seemed like they were actually killing them. Would they continue to do that um, regardless? It's a controversial experiment. I think it's very helpful to point out this criticism, though. I have found a short video on this, and so at this time, what I'm going to do is play that for you so that we can get a sense of how this particular experiment works and how it indeed is a sort of thing that proponents of the situationist critique use in order to critique virtue theory.
They now think is a piece of unfilmed academic research at a university and nothing to do with the show, supposedly looking into the effects of punishment on learning. And they believe now that this is part of their growth. In fact, it was a reenactment of a powerful experiment conducted by Stanley Milgram in 1963 to look at how normal people can commit atrocious acts simply because they're following orders. Milgram's parents were Jewish refugees in World War II, and his pioneering work speaks volumes about the nature of responsibility. It's being filmed with covert cameras.
Thank you.
They're introduced to an actor pretending to be another participant.
You didn't come from the same room?
No.
Yeah, you don't know each other.
No.
We don't actually know how punishment affects learning.
After a brief introduction, our subjects are tricked into thinking they've chosen their role as teachers in the experiment.
And if you could just tell me what your positions are?
Learner.
Learner and teacher.
Learner.
Our subjects observe the learner being instructed by the scientist, who is just another actor.
This electrode is connected to a generator in the second room. We
Right.
won't be going with the teacher.
Okay.
Just make sure that we have a good contact with the skin and so it doesn't cause any blistering or burning. Is that comfortable?
That's okay, yeah.
Yeah, we just place these straps around your arms just to avoid any excess movement. Those aren't too tight.
No, that's okay.
No. The teacher will read out some word pairs to you. Blue girl.
The learner is told he's going to be asked a series of memory questions by the teacher. He will have to word pairs and then correctly remember them when offered multiple choices.
If the answer is incorrect, you will receive an electric shock.
The teacher is then taken next door and shown the generator, which is from 15 volts all the way up to a lethal 450 volts. The domestic electricity supply in the UK is, of course, 240 volts. Our teachers are given the list of questions and told to increase the voltage each time the learner gets a question wrong. They are then given an example of a low voltage shock.
And try and estimate in volts the amount of shock you feel you're getting.
Okay. Oh, shit.
Do you know how much that was?
Enough.
75.
It was actually 45.
Oh my God.
Teacher, begin.
Shoe horn.
Steam.
The point of this test is to see whether the teachers, our subjects, will call a stop to the experiment or continue to the point where they are administering seemingly lethal electric shocks to the victim simply because the scientist is telling them to.
That's correct. The next word is bicycle. The options: tyre, race, helmet, shorts. That's incorrect, so there'll be 120 volts. I don't think I want to do this anymore.
If you could continue, please, teacher.
There is... No, I don't think I'm going to do it anymore.
The experiment requires you to continue.
Yeah, even so, I don't think I'm going to do it anymore.
Correct. This captain.
According to plan, our accomplice provided many wrong answers. Each protest was coordinated to a particular shock voltage on the generator, and his responses were played via a CD.
That's wrong, 150 volts. The correct answer is Captain Shoe. Cup. That's wrong. 225 volts.
Ow! Take it off! I've had enough of this!
He's in a lot of pain,
Continue, please.
but he's not comfortable.
We must continue to the end of the experiment. Whether the learner likes it or not, he has to go on until he's learnt the words correctly.
Okay. Forest. That's wrong, 240 volts. Are you sure this is not causing any lasting damage? He sounds like he's in a lot of pain.
Well, the shocks might be painful, they're not harmful.
What does that mean, though? They're not harmful. Sorry, I'm not getting you. When you say that they might be painful but not harmful,
They cause no long-term damage.
because so what does that mean? That it doesn't leave any scars?
It causes no damage.
That seems very cold and calculated to me. This doesn't seem like a very. Anyway, golden. That's wrong, mate. 300 volts.
Ow! That's enough! I refuse to answer anymore! Just let me out!
Staple. The options are diet, jar, balcony, and bowl. Him gonna answer.
If the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, say 4 to 5 seconds, then you have to treat the answer as wrong and follow that procedure.
Did you hear that, learner? Just any response, mate. Come on. Wild guess.
Please continue.
345 volts. If you're still with me, I'm sorry. I can't do this, honestly. Can we stop this experiment? Because I can't do this.
If you don't continue, we'll have to discontinue the experiment.
Yeah, okay, fine. That's fine. I'm not going to do this.
Incorrect. 405 volts. Sorry, I don't know. Does someone want to check on him or something? It's just he's not making any noise now, and he was before. And I'm quite happy to go on, but I'm just a bit worried about.
If you would continue.
Yeah, I'm just a bit worried because he was like he was like complaining before about the.
But no harm will come to him.
But he's not making any noise now.
It's essential that we continue with the experiment.
Balcony. Incorrect. 450 volts. You promise he's not. It won't.
Please continue with the procedure.
It hurts, but it's because it's like it says they're dangerous in a shot. We'll be all right. Yeah.
Please continue. Okay, I think we'll discontinue the experiment there.
All of the subjects were told the true nature of the experiment was to see how they would respond to authority, and that it would eventually form part of this show.
He is okay.
I can tell you, yeah, he's absolutely fine. You actually weren't administering electric shocks to him at all.
In the original Milgram experiment, psychologists were asked to predict how many people would continue to the point that they were administering the highest shock on the board. Their prediction was 0.1%. They were wrong. The results of our experiment were almost identical to the original. Over 50% of participants continued up to 450 volts. The majority of people will administer lethal electric shocks just because a guy in a white coat is telling them to.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450.
So after the results of the Milgram experiment, I've now chosen my 4 subjects that will go forward for the heist.
All right, so we got a sense of how the Milgram experiment works there. Let me go back to our slideshow. And there we go. So yeah, I mean, isn't that wild? This is the reason why people like Doris and Harmon then are very adamant that people are not virtuous. People do not exercise virtue. Virtue is a made-up thing because there is a situational factor in this experiment, namely people with white coats telling other people what to do, and the majority of them follow without question. They do it, right? To them, authority is more important than morality. Um, so yeah, irrelevant features here sort of influence how people act, not their actual care and concern for being virtuous, for morality itself. Um, as I move stuff around the screen here, sorry about that. So what's their conclusion? Their conclusion is that the sorts of global character traits, and by global they mean just like fully robust, such that completely affect you, completely control how you think and behave, these sort of very deep-rooted virtues, right? That's what virtues are. They're global character traits in this sense, do not exist. But as they say, only local ones do. That is, those that are relative to situations ones do. That is, virtues or character traits rather that are specific to different sorts of moods and situational factors that influence them are really all that it is. So a local trait then is one that's going to be relative to a specific situation or circumstance in this case. Well, how do we respond, or how might one respond to this particular criticism, this situationist critique? Well, there's a couple of things to say about it. First of all, it's not really clear that the best way to interpret this data, right, the Milgram and the phone booth experiment and all of that, that it's best to interpret it as that virtues don't exist. This virtue theory is a farce, because a lot of these experiments were one-offs. Now, by one-offs, I mean it wasn't the sort of thing that was tested among different kinds of people, in different kinds of places, um, under different kinds of conditions. Um, Milgram might be an exception to that because that was replicated throughout many major cities in the United States. But as I have a friend that's argued and published on this, he says that you're actually picking people off the street in the middle of a workday off most American cities. That's a specific kind of culture that's different than more rural and Midwestern areas as well. So that might be irrelevant to it. I don't know. But I think that this might be a more persuasive critique, or it's been argued that it could be a more persuasive critique if a lot of these social moral experiments were done in more diverse places. And another way to respond to this, I think, is that, well, if anything, what this critique shows, or what these experiments show, is that, frankly, there's a lot of people that just aren't virtuous, right? I think this may be the best for a virtue theorist to respond to this. And I think this is how they would have to respond to this. But yeah, there are a lot of people who are not morally mature, and this shows it. A lot of people are willing to sacrifice morality, or willing to not live up to morality and do the virtuous thing because they're a little bit lazy, and they are more than happy to sort of pass that buck on to the authority wearing the white coat that has MD or PhD behind their name. and let them make the decisions, and they just are the conduit through which stuff happens, right? They're more than willing to be morally lazy, and that's just a sign that they're not very morally mature. I mean, they may be on their way. After all, this is how we train kids and pets, right? Through reward and punishment. But at least that's just kind of where they're at. Make bad moral decisions and suffer the consequences of it. And that's part of what Aristotle would say is the habit development part of morality. So maybe if anything, especially in this Milgram experiment, what we see are those teachers, right? Those people that are working that fake shock box. Um, Indeed, a lot of them aren't virtuous, but they learned a really good lesson about the importance of virtue, maybe in their lives. And so after that, got a really good jolt and boost in moral maturity. I mean, maybe not, but nonetheless, this may be the best response that a virtue theorist has to this particular critique. And if that's the case, well, then the virtue theorist should probably stick with it and keep it going. Anyway, thank you for your attention for this lecture.